So after the Texans recapture San Antonio in December of 35, they do something really dumb. And this is almost completely forgotten in the history of the Texas Revolution. So the Texas armies recapture San Antonio, and then under the leadership of a guy named James Grant, and I'm not going to make you remember this guy's name because it's a little bit too detailed. Here's what I want you to remember. The Texas Army recaptures San Antonio in December of 1835 and then starts marching towards Matamoros, which is crazy, right? This is just like 3 months before the Alamo. Why does the Texas Army start marching from San Antonio to Matamoros? Well, there were elements of the Texas Army leadership that thought that people in Matamoros might support the Texans in their fight against Santa Anna, which is kind of crazy. It probably wouldn't have happened that way. What was probably really true was some of the leadership of the Texas Army at this point. And remember, this isn't Sam Houston. This is just the leaders on the spot in San Antonio. Some of the leaders of what's called the Matamoros expedition, it was probably a land grab on their part. They wanted to go into Mexico and capture land along the Rio Grande. But whatever the reasons, here's the main point. The Texas Army recaptures San Antonio December 35 and then starts marching to Matamoros. Okay? Really a crazy thing to do. Because, and I'm going to show you a map. I'm going to bring up a map now that I've sent, that I'll post when I send out the announcement of this lecture. If you look at the map that I'm sending you, right about the time that the Texas Army is heading towards Matamoros, Santa Anna is building up his army to attack Texas. And his army, Santa Anna's army, is going to come into Texas near Guerrero, kind of in the Laredo Eagle Pass area. So the Texas army that has captured San Antonio starts moving towards Matamoros at about the same time that Santa Anna's army starts moving towards San Antonio. So the Texas army in San Antonio is going completely away from Santa Anna's army. The Texas army is going south. At the same moment, Santa Anna's army is going north. It's ridiculous. So Houston, who has been appointed head of the Texas Army, he realizes that the folks that had captured San Antonio and that were moving towards Matamoros, he realizes this is a huge mistake. It's a huge mistake. And then he tries to go down and he tries to stop this army from attacking Matamoros. Okay? So that's Houston's role here. He had not been part of the leadership. He had not been part of the recapture of San Antonio in 1835 at all. He had not been involved in that at all. He had not been part of the leadership that made this crazy decision to march towards Matamoros after the recapture of San Antonio. He thought that it was just a crazy idea, and so he tries to go and stop it. So he rides down and he gives a speech in Refugio, Texas. And the whole point of his visit to the army there is just to say, guys, this is really dumb. Stop what you're doing. Don't go to Matamoros. Let's concentrate our army in central Texas because Santa Anna is coming in from Laredo. He's coming in from the Eagle Pass area. And it's insane to go to Matamoros. Okay, so that's what this whole Matamoros expedition is about. Houston is successful. The Matamoros expedition is stopped. He takes some of the men back with him. He's creating an army kind of in the area north of LaGrange, that area. Elements of the Matamoros expedition also stay in Goliad, and they will be captured and executed in March 1836. So That's what Houston is doing in Refugio. He's trying to stop the Matamoros expedition, which he is successful in doing. Now, the other thing that once he does that, he sends Jim Bowie back to San Antonio, and I'll talk about Jim Bowie in a second. And he says, "Look, I want you to evacuate San Antonio. There's no way we can really defend it, and I want you to concentrate your men with my army." Well, Jim Bowie goes back to San Antonio, and he decides to stay, which turns out to be a terrible decision. But let's stop for a second. Okay, so let's go back to Crisp now. So what Crisp is reading about this whole Refugio speech, it's the quotes that he reads makes Houston sound like a racist. That Houston is talking about Mexican Americans as if they're indolent. That he talks about. This is page 38. This is the quote that Crisp is reading. That Houston is saying that Tejanos and Mexicans are half Indians. And so basically, the historical records seem to show that Houston was racist towards Tejanos and Mexicans. Well, when Crisp read that speech, it didn't ring true to him. It just didn't seem right, because Crisp, in his studies, knew that Sam Houston had a great deal of respect for Juan Seguin before, during, and after the Texas Revolution. And that Houston was not really the type of guy to use racist language. So what Crisp does is he looked deeper into the origins of this so-called speech that Sam Houston gave. And he wanted to see, was Sam Houston quoted correctly? And what we might say today is that he thought that Houston's speech, the quote that he read of Houston's speech, the quote that was often given, he thought it was fake news. He thought it was fake. He thought it was made up. So he knew that Houston gave a speech in Refugio. There's no doubt about that. Okay, there's no doubt about that, because we saw the consequences of that speech. The Matamoros expedition is halted. But the content of that speech is very highly contested. And when Houston looked into the content of the speech, Crisp looked into the content of the speech, he realized what had happened. Two things had happened. First of all, that's the speech that Houston gave, the content of the speech, was quoted by this guy named Ehrenberg. And Ehrenberg was a German. He was a young German, young male. He had come from Europe. He ended up in Texas during the Texas Revolution. He was captured at Goliad, and he was one of the 2 or 3 dozen Texans that survived the massacre at Goliad. And then he went back to Germany and wrote an account of his time in Texas. And he quoted Sam Houston. And Crisp just doesn't think that Ehrenberg quoted Houston right. That Ehrenberg exaggerated. He exaggerated Houston's racism towards people of Mexican descent and Mexicans. Maybe Ehrenberg is kind of reflecting his own view of people from Mexico and Mexican Americans. So that's number one. That this quote is the original source for the content of the quote, this guy named Ehrenberg, can't be trusted. Yes, Houston did give a speech, but it seems highly unlikely that he would have said the racist things in the speech. And the speech is on page 36 that Ehrenberg has him saying. Number two, the Ehrenberg speech is not translated into English until the 1920s. It's translated by this guy named Bartholomew, who was a student at UT Austin. And Crisp shows that Bartholomew, who translated the speech in 1925, mistranslated it. That he didn't have a good understanding of the German. And so all this adds up to the creation of a speech The speech happened, yes, but the content of the speech, Chris believes, was not racist in the way that this primary source seemed to indicate. And other historians had believed Ehrenberg. They had believed that Houston had given a racist speech. Chris doesn't believe Ehrenberg. And he can't, he can't question Ehrenberg, because Ehrenberg's dead. But how Chris refutes Ehrenberg, and I've said this a couple of times now, Chris points out the fact that Houston greatly respected Tejanos. He worked with Tejanos, he worked with Seguin especially, and that he would not have said these racist things. And here's the bigger point. This idea that Houston had given a speech where he made racist comments about Tejanos and Mexicans, that fed into the idea that the Texas Revolution was a race war, right? Remember, I talked about in my first podcast, the whole point of the Chris book is to prove that the Texas Revolution was not a race war. It wasn't brown people versus white people. Chris points out that Tejano supported the Texas Revolution. So that's the whole point of this chapter 2, the speech writers. Houston did give a speech in order to stop the Matamoros expedition, but Chris does not believe the speech that Houston gave was racist in the way that many historians have believed it was racist. Chris argues that the source for this guy named Ehrenberg, who had fought in the Texas Revolution and then wrote an account of it that was published 100 years later, wildly exaggerated or even falsified Houston's racism, and that historians had accepted this source, but that they shouldn't. It was a false source. It was fake news. That Houston wasn't racist and he wouldn't use this language. So the point of this paragraph, Chris is trying to again argue that the belief that the Texas Revolution was a race war was based in part on faulty evidence. Yes, Houston gave a speech, but it was not a speech that was laced with racism directed towards Tejanos and Mexicans.